What did ancient humans do when someone in their group died? Picture a funeral tonight, somewhere in your city. Soft music plays. Someone lowers a bundle of white flowers onto a casket. A few people cry quietly, then drive home and try to feel normal again by morning. Someone stands up to read a eulogy, voice catching halfway through the first sentence. A folder of photographs gets passed hand to hand. A whole life folded down into a slideshow and a printed program. It feels like a deeply modern ritual. Organized, emotional, deliberate. You might assume a ritual like that belongs only to us, built by people who had temples, prayers, and printed programs to hold their grief. Strip all of that structure away, and it's easy to picture ancient humans doing the opposite. Walking off, leaving a body where it fell, because there was no time to spare on someone who couldn't hunt tomorrow. That assumption is wrong, and not by a small margin. Long before farming, long before writing, long before our species even had the world to itself, something was already kneeling beside a body, arranging it, choosing deliberately not to leave. So why do we assume grief for the dead is something we invented? Part of the answer is a story that science told about itself and got badly wrong for almost a century. That story starts not with one triumphant discovery, but with 4 separate graves spread across 3 continents and tens of thousands of years, each one quietly making the same point. In 1908, deep inside a cave called La Chapelle aux Saints in southern France, workers uncovered the skeleton of a Neanderthal, an extinct relative of modern humans, curled inside a shallow pit. A French paleontologist named Marcelin Boule examined the bones and reached a confident verdict. This was a slouching, brutish creature, barely upright, barely human. For decades, that single skeleton shaped how the entire world pictured Neanderthals, in textbooks, in museum dioramas, in movies. Hunched, dim-witted, closer to an animal than a person. Only decades later did researchers look again and find what Boule had missed. His subject had severe arthritis in the spine, the hips, the jaw. The man hadn't been built that way. He'd simply grown old and sick, likely fed and supported by others long after he could hunt or gather for himself. And when he finally died, someone still buried him, deliberately, in a shaped pit, roughly 50,000 years ago. That's not the behavior of a brute. That's the behavior of a community that decided one of its own, even broken, even unproductive, still deserved to be laid to rest with care. Travel east, into the Zagros Mountains of Iraq, and the story deepens further. In Shanidar Cave, archaeologist Ralph Selecki spent the 1950s uncovering Neanderthal skeleton after skeleton. One of them lay curled beside strange clusters of ancient pollen. Researchers proposed something extraordinary, that Neanderthals had laid flowers over their dead. The idea spread everywhere. Textbooks, documentaries. A species dismissed for decades as brutish suddenly seemed capable of tenderness, of beauty, of grief expressed through color. Later scientists pushed back hard, arguing the pollen more likely blew in from burrowing rodents than from mourners, and that the flower story was wishful thinking dressed up as science. Then, in 2020, a team returned to the cave and found fresh pollen clusters gathered near yet another undisturbed skeleton. The debate reopened, and honestly, it may never fully close. But here's what isn't in dispute. Something in that cave, again and again, across thousands of years, was arranged, protected, returned to. Whether or not the flowers were real, the intention behind the burial wasn't. Move south to Kafza Cave in what's now Israel, and you find a different kind of evidence entirely. Around 100,000 years ago, early Homo sapiens, our own species, buried their dead there, and they didn't do it plainly. Bodies were placed alongside red ochre, an iron-rich pigment, and pierced shell beads, materials that had to be found, carried from elsewhere, and applied on purpose. That's not the residue of survival. Nobody needs red pigment to stay alive. That's symbolic behavior, the same instinct that later paints a face for a wedding, dresses a body for a viewing, or lays a single rose across a folded flag. Then there's Sungir, in what's now Russia. Around 30,000 years ago, 2 children were buried there, head to head, wrapped in close to 10,000 carved mammoth ivory beads. Archaeologists estimate each bead took roughly an hour to make by hand. Do that math for a second. Thousands of hours of labor poured into two small bodies that would never hunt, never speak, never give anything back. Across roughly 20 confirmed Neanderthal burial sites, and dozens more belonging to early Homo sapiens, the same pattern keeps surfacing. Bodies moved, arranged, sometimes colored, sometimes surrounded by objects their owners could no longer use. Something was happening at every one of those graves that had nothing to do with survival. Notice what all four of these places actually require. A grave has to be dug in advance of decay, which means someone has to recognize clearly that a body will not get up again. Pigment has to be sourced from somewhere else and carried back. Beads have to be carved one by one over hours that could have gone toward hunting or building shelter, or simply resting. None of that is instinct in the way flinching from fire is instinct. It requires a brain capable of imagining a future its owner will never share in, and choosing to spend real time on it anyway. But what if the flowers were never really the point? The deeper discovery here isn't one dramatic image, a single bouquet resting on a Neanderthal's chest. It's that the impulse behind it, the refusal to just walk away from a body, shows up again and again across tens of thousands of years, and possibly across more than one species of human. We're not even the only ones who seem to carry it. Elephants have been observed returning to the bones of dead herd members, touching the skulls gently with their trunks, sometimes lingering for hours. Chimpanzees have been seen carrying dead infants for days, unwilling to set them down. Researchers who study this behavior see it as evidence of an animal that fully understands a companion isn't simply asleep or gone temporarily, but permanently, irreversibly absent. Even crows will gather silently around a dead member of their flock before dispersing, a behavior researchers have started calling something close to mourning. None of that is culture, passed down through funerals and hymns and inherited belief. It looks a lot more like something wired in. Psychologists describe grief, at its root, as an attachment response, the same wiring that makes a toddler cry when a parent leaves the room, just aimed at a loss with no possibility of return. Grief for the dead may not be an invention of civilization at all. It may be one of the oldest instincts a social brain can carry, surfacing wherever a group loses someone it depended on. There's a reasonable evolutionary case for why an instinct like that would stick around. A species that grieves is a species that forms deep bonds in the first place, bonds strong enough to drive real cooperation, food sharing, and defense of the group when it mattered most. Grief might simply be the cost that comes with exactly the kind of social glue that let our ancestors survive at all. Today we still can't just walk away either. We still choose flowers. Specific colors, specific arrangements, even when we can't fully explain why we pick them. We still spend real money and real time on caskets, headstones, and services for people who will never know we did it. Different cultures wrap that instinct in different clothing. Sitting Shiva, holding a wake, burning incense, scattering marigolds across a grave. None of it requires religious belief either. Even committed atheists build small rituals around a death. A moment of silence, a candle left burning, an urn kept on a shelf where it can still be seen every day. But the underlying refusal to simply move on looks remarkably similar wherever you look. Grief counselors will tell you the ritual was never really for the dead. It's for the living, a structure that gives shape to an absence that would otherwise feel formless and unbearable. That instinct to build a ritual around loss, to refuse to just leave a body where it fell, apparently didn't start with a culture, or a religion, or even our species. Every piece of that instinct, the flowers, the stillness, the refusal to simply move on, was already old before recorded history even started counting years. So the next time you set flowers down on a grave, whose ritual are you actually finishing? It might be older than your species.